Today, we're going to look at the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8Z DF DSM full-frame lens for Nikon Z mount. So at this time, that means it's compatible with the Nikon Z mount cameras, including the Z5, Z6, Z6 II, Z7, Z7 II, Z8 and Z9 cameras, and the new ZF, as well as DX cameras that will give you an equivalent 75mm focal length. Good for portraits. The so-called nifty-fifty lens has always been popular, approximating as it does the normal human field of vision. Now, some of us aren't exactly normal, but for the sake of this video, we'll go along with that. Certainly, 50mm is a good focal length to have in your bag or fixed to your camera in your studio, because assuming you've watched the videos on this channel for some time, you've seen some others, a 50mm f1.8 is the lens you've been looking through most of the time for at least the last 5 years. When I bought the NIKKOR Z 50mm f1.8S with my first Z6 camera. And the Yongnuo equivalent is what you're looking through right now. It's attached to my usual A camera, the Nikon Z8. And I'm going to brave the lights with no skin softening, which is an option on the Z8 camera, as well as the ZF, which I also own right here. So you get the unfiltered best from this lens. And yeah, there's no filter of any kind on this lens right now, but if you do add a protective filter, the filter diameter is 58mm. Now, Yongnuo reached out and asked if I'd be interested in testing out this lens. I said yes. I have no obligations other than that to make this independent review. And this isn't a sponsored video, despite YouTube's requirement that I disclose in those words that I've received something of value. I will add purchase links in the description. Quickly, because I'm not going to go on at length about the technical specs, I'll include a gallery of actual photos and video examples made with this lens shortly, so you can draw your own conclusions. This is, of course, a full-frame f1.8 50mm focal length lens. Minimum aperture is f16. It's built with 11 optical lens elements in 8 groups and features nano multi-layer coating to combat flare and other similar aberrations. There are 9 circular aperture blades, and we'll see later how this affects bokeh. Firmware upgrades are possible via USB-C located on the side of the lens barrel, sealed by a rubber plug. I'll make my first criticism here. This port should have been positioned somewhere around the mount, like other third-party lenses that feature USB ports for that function. I'm wondering how long before I lose this little plug, though it is difficult to remove. Bayonet mount is metal and contacts are gold-plated, and this lens does have a rubber gasket to protect against moisture ingress. Maximum magnification is 0.15 times. The closest focusing distance is 0.45 meters. It has dual programmable FN function buttons. That's something you don't get with the native Nikon equivalent. However, you can only program one function shared between both buttons. The manual focus ring can also be used as a control ring, so you can assign common functions like aperture, ISO, exposure compensation, etc. Note, the control ring function works only when in autofocus. There's an autofocus manual focus mode switch. The lens build looks decent. The main barrel made with sandblasted aviation aluminum alloy. The overall construction of the lens is compact. Its maximum diameter and length is 68 by 87 millimeters, and quite lightweight at about 417 grams. Autofocus is quiet, powered by a DSM digital stepping motor. In terms of overall weatherproofing, Yongnuo warns the bayonet of the lens has a certain degree of waterproof performance, but it's not completely waterproof. If you are shooting in rainy days, please try to keep the lens from getting wet. Well, that's definitely something to take into consideration on a day like today. And believe me, it was raining pretty hard not long ago. And then we got a break in the weather and it's warmed up and it's actually drying up. But what I wanted to say here is that 50mm is not the first focal length that I think of when I'm shooting on the street, or I guess in this case, in the arena. I like something a little bit wider, say 35mm. But not that I'm totally inflexible on that. In fact, I've used an 85mm to good effect on occasion. And 50mm is also a nice in-between and works quite well. So Point being, we're going to see what we can get with this Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 lens. To tell the truth, 50mm is also not my go-to portrait lens either. But again, it has its place on occasion, and 1.8 is helpful in isolating the subject. At the end of the day, yes, it helps in low light too, but ultimately it's a case of you get what you pay for. And at $359 US, I think this is a pretty good deal. No, it doesn't match the NIKKOR Z equivalent in terms of absolute IQ, but that lens generally sells for $527 US. And you'd likely be disappointed if you compare it with a $1,900 NIKKOR 50mm f1.2. But let's be fair, it depends on your use case and budget. As we can see in this image, there is some chromatic aberration, and I don't usually see pink chromatic aberration, but in this lens, I've noticed it a few times. Here's some purple fringing here. So we do have, in this backlit situation, some chromatic aberration. Also in this image, same thing around the pepper shaker here, the holes in the pepper shaker. Again, that pink reddish chromatic aberration. And also here, on this shiny surface, we see some cyan. The focus tracking is pretty reliable. In these clips, I'm using full-time AFF, auto area mode. You guessed it, I'm not a hockey player. And the cold snap didn't last long enough to flood this outdoor arena to freeze and hold a game or two. And wide L area in this hummingbird clip. It's pretty decent. However, if your use case includes video, this really isn't the lens for you. Notwithstanding the fact that I'm using it for this talking head footage, I can't recommend it overall for video. Not due to any failure in terms of relative image quality or the focus performance, but the lens falls short because of its uncontrolled focus breathing. This lens has tons of it across the range of focus. And I think that's illustrated in these clips. It's not that we haven't seen this kind of focus breathing in movies, and this lens is not the only lens to exhibit the issue. There are more expensive lenses that show it, or only compensate digitally by cropping. But today, it's not something we tend to embrace, shall we say. And lenses, like the Nikon Z mount, have generally controlled focus breathing very well. Dedicated filmmakers also tend to steer clear of focus by wire lenses, and that includes all of the Nikon Z lenses. But I can track focus manually with those lenses, even if it's not possible to set defined A and B limits with a follow focus mechanism. But this Yongnuo lens, sorry, no cigar. The focus throw, for some reason, is very uneven as well. I find it impossible to perform a nice, even focus pull. Otherwise, as I say, and as these clips illustrate, focus acquisition and tracking is acceptable. Perhaps not quite as fast and accurate as with the NIKKOR Z equivalent, but if I didn't compare it, I wouldn't make a point of it. Maybe on rare occasions, I've noticed focus hunting. I'm talking both for still photo and video. Again, it's not as if the native equivalents are perfect in this regard either. If shooting in challenging conditions, maybe backlit or low contrast. Now I just wanted to show you these two images for comparison. On the left hand side we have the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 lens, and on the right side we have its equivalent, the NIKKOR 50mm f1.8s. So, well, the first thing that we can see here is that the Yongnuo doesn't have the same focal length as the 50mm from Nikon. So who's zooming who here? One is not 50mm. Maybe neither of them are. But the point being that they're certainly not the same focal length. In terms of IQ, it's really close. Very, very close, I would say. But we can see that the Yongnuo is softer, so they're both wide open at 1.8, but I don't know what we can draw from that. But it does give you an idea of what you're going to get from the Yongnuo lens if you were to compare it to its NIKKOR equivalent. Now I could spend some time here going through these images and showing you that wide open at f1.8. Yes, this lens is a little soft in the corners, even in the middle somewhat, wide open. But the thing that I really wanted to illustrate, let's go into the develop module here, because this is interesting. If we look at the profiles, we can see that the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 lens is here, and the make is Nikon. Now, messing around a little bit here, I discovered that in fact we can find Yongnuo right there, and we see what happens when we change to that. And so we have that lens there, and now it defaulted to the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 Canon. Now watch what happens when I switch to Nikon Corporation. Now we get real corrections. So that's just something to note. This is in Lightroom. I can't speak for other software like Capture One, but that's something to note. So while one can't expect perfection at $359, I think this lens is good value, and I'm looking forward to see what this brand comes up with next. So I hope this review proved informative. If you found it useful, please do give it the old thumbs up. And if this is your first visit to the channel, or you're one of the 87% of visitors not subscribed, please do consider subscribing. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. In the meantime, take care, cheers, and we'll see you later.